where permission quietly begins. Hold this point steady as we begin. Nothing outside you has the power to command your inner life. Events arrive. Words are spoken. Circumstances shift. None of these, by themselves, create a disturbance. They are neutral. What follows depends on a single internal act that often goes unnoticed, whether your mind grants permission. This is the core Stoic claim, and it is not comforting. Disturbance does not come from what happens. It comes from what you agree to about what happens. The mind receives impressions automatically. That part is not chosen. But the moment the mind says, "This is bad," or "This should not be happening," or "I cannot tolerate this," something decisive occurs. You have assented. You have authorized the reaction. Responsibility enters here. Not as blame, and not as moral pressure, but as a simple fact. You cannot outsource judgment. You cannot assign it to circumstances, to other people, or to your past. If disturbance appears, it is because permission was granted somewhere inside. This is not an accusation. It is a description of how the mechanism works. Stoic discipline begins by refusing to argue with events. It does not try to reshape the world to feel better. It turns inward and asks a narrower, more demanding question: what exactly did I agree to just now? Until this question becomes familiar, freedom remains abstract. There is no promise here of comfort. There is only clarity. If judgment creates disturbance, then judgment is where discipline must operate. Everything else is secondary. Notice this carefully. What falls within your authority? Everything that follows depends on one clear distinction. Some things are yours. Some things are not. This sounds simple, almost trivial, yet most frustration comes from treating this boundary as negotiable. The Stoics were precise about this because discipline collapses without precision. If you do not know what belongs to you, effort is scattered and resentment grows quietly. What belongs to you is narrow. Your judgments, your intentions, your choices, your refusals, the way you interpret what appears in your mind. These are under your authority. No one else can step inside this domain unless you allow it. Even strong emotion does not cross this boundary by force. It enters only when judgment opens the gate. What does not belong to you is far broader. Other people's behavior, their opinions, the timing of events, outcomes, recognition, reputation, the body's involuntary reactions, the past, the future. None of these are under your command, no matter how strongly you wish otherwise. Treating them as if they were is the beginning of inner conflict. This distinction is not moral. It is functional. When you attempt to control what is not yours, you experience friction. When you neglect what is yours, you experience confusion. Most people do both at the same time. They try to manage outcomes and ignore judgments. Then they wonder why effort produces tension instead of clarity. Consider a simple example. Someone speaks to you sharply. The words arrive without invitation. That is not under your control. The sound enters the ear. The impression forms. But the thought, "I am being disrespected," is not forced upon you. It is a judgment. When you agree with it, the body tightens, the mind accelerates, and reaction feels inevitable. Yet nothing external crossed into your authority. You handed it over. Or consider delay. You are waiting for a response that does not come. Time passes. Impatience appears. The delay itself is neutral. It is not an insult. It is not a verdict on your worth. But the mind says, "This should have happened by now," and irritation follows. Again, the disturbance is not in the delay. It is in the demand you added to it. Stoic discipline begins by withdrawing claims you never truly owned. You stop demanding that people behave differently so that you can remain steady. You stop insisting that circumstances cooperate with your preferences. This is not resignation. It is accuracy. You are returning responsibility to the only place it can function. This also explains why advice focused on controlling outcomes feels exhausting. It asks you to invest effort where effort has no authority. The Stoic approach does the opposite. It reduces the field of responsibility so that discipline becomes possible. When responsibility is placed correctly, effort becomes lighter, not heavier. There is often resistance here. The mind says, if I stop trying to control outcomes, nothing will improve. But this confuses influence with authority. You can act, speak, plan, and attempt. These are choices. They belong to you. What follows does not. Discipline lies in making your choice well, then releasing ownership of the result. When this boundary is respected, something subtle happens. You stop arguing with reality. You stop replaying conversations in search of a better outcome. Attention returns to judgment, where adjustment is actually possible. This is not a loss of ambition. It is a correction of aim. The foundation is now in place. You know what is yours, and what never was. This explains where effort is misplaced, but not yet how disturbance takes hold, the point where agreement occurs. Now we look at what actually creates disturbance. Every experience begins the same way. Something appears. A sound, an image, a memory, a physical sensation, a remark from another person. The Stoics call this an impression. Impressions are automatic. They arrive without asking. You do not choose them, and you are not responsible for their arrival. What matters is what happens next. An impression by itself is inert. It has no authority. It does not yet mean anything. But the mind has a habit of moving quickly. It interprets. It labels. It decides. This is the moment Epictetus focused on with relentless precision. Between the impression and the reaction, there is an act of agreement. The Stoics called this assent. Assent is not loud. It does not announce itself. It often feels instantaneous, which is why it is overlooked. The thought "this is bad," or "this is unfair," or "this threatens me" appears to merge with the impression itself. But they are not the same. One is received. The other is granted. Impressions are not optional. Assent is. This distinction is the hinge of Stoic freedom. You may feel anger arise. That is an impression combined with bodily response. It is not yet a failure of discipline. Discipline fails only when the mind says, yes, this anger is justified, or this must be acted upon, or this defines what is happening. That quiet agreement turns sensation into disturbance. Consider criticism. Someone questions your work. The words are heard. A tightening in the chest follows. This is normal. Then a thought appears, I am being attacked, or they do not respect me. If the mind accepts this judgment as true, agitation escalates. The body prepares for defense. Speech sharpens. The situation feels personal. But nothing external forced this escalation. It occurred at the point of assent. Or consider delay again. You expect a reply. None arrives. The impression is simply the absence of a message. Neutral. Then the thought arises, I am being ignored. When this judgment is accepted, impatience and resentment follow. But the impression did not say this. The mind added it. The Stoics were careful here. They did not argue that feelings should not arise. They argued that feelings do not have to be believed. There is a difference between experiencing an impulse and endorsing it. One happens to you. The other is done by you. This is why Stoic discipline emphasizes the pause. Not a dramatic pause. Not a forced calm. A brief suspension of agreement. A single breath is often enough. In that moment, the mind asks a simple question, is this impression telling me a fact, or am I supplying a judgment? The question itself weakens automatic assent. Most people never practice this interruption. They live as if impressions and judgments are fused. As if feeling something proves it is true. As if intensity equals accuracy. Stoicism breaks this assumption. It treats the mind as something to be trained, not obeyed. This training is not abstract. It occurs in ordinary moments, repeatedly. Each time assent is delayed, even briefly, authority returns inward. You begin to see that disturbance is not inevitable. It is constructed, step by step, through agreement. This does not mean you become passive. It means you become precise. You still act. You still respond. But you do so after choosing what you will agree to. That choice is the smallest unit of freedom available to you. Understanding this mechanism is necessary, but it is not sufficient. Seeing where assent occurs does not prevent it from happening. The mind must be trained to recognize this point under pressure. Understanding this does not create discipline, training the mind without force. This is where most people misunderstand discipline. Discipline is often imagined as pressure applied inward. Teeth clenched. Emotions suppressed. Endurance praised. This model fails quickly because it treats the mind as an enemy to be overpowered. Stoic discipline does the opposite. It treats the mind as something to be trained through clarity and repetition. Force is unreliable. It works briefly, then collapses under stress. Training is quieter. It builds capacity before pressure arrives. This difference matters. When difficulty appears, you do not rise to the level of your intentions. You fall to the level of your training. Stoic discipline is not about removing emotion. Impressions will continue to arise. Feelings will still appear. The body will still react. None of this is a problem. The aim is not numbness. The aim is to maintain the ability to choose what you agree with, even when sensations are strong. Training begins with attention. Not constant vigilance, but repeated noticing. You start by observing how quickly the mind moves from impression to conclusion. How often it says this means something without checking whether that meaning is necessary or accurate. Each observation weakens the illusion that reactions are automatic. This is why repetition matters more than willpower. Willpower is episodic. It depends on mood, energy, and circumstance. Training depends on consistency. You practice in low-stakes moments so that the response is available in high-stakes ones. Discipline that only appears during crises is not discipline. It is improvisation. Consider how this works in practice. A small irritation arises. Someone interrupts you. The impulse to react appears. Instead of suppressing it, you notice it. You label it as an impression. You do not argue with it. You simply refuse to add a verdict. This may last only a second. That second is the training. Over time, these seconds accumulate. The pause becomes familiar. The mind learns that it does not have to agree immediately. This is not a philosophical insight. It is a conditioned response. Like any training, it feels awkward at first. Then neutral. Then natural. Stoic discipline also rejects self-punishment. Missing the pause is not a failure requiring guilt. Guilt is itself an unexamined judgment. It says, "I should have been different just now." This adds another layer of assent on top of the first. Training resumes by returning to observation, not by escalating self-criticism. Another misunderstanding is the belief that discipline must feel hard to be effective. This confuses effort with strain. Effective training is often subtle. You are not forcing the mind to comply. You are teaching it a new default. Over time, the effort required decreases, not increases. This approach also explains why Stoic discipline emphasizes preparation before difficulty. You do not wait until anger is overwhelming to remember judgment. You practice when irritation is mild. You do not wait for crisis to consider control. You rehearse the distinction daily. Training that begins under pressure is already late. Importantly, this discipline does not remove responsibility. It sharpens it. You stop blaming emotions for reactions. You stop blaming circumstances for loss of control. You accept that the moment of assent is always yours, even if it is brief and often missed. This acceptance is not heavy. It is stabilizing. As training continues, something changes quietly. You still feel impulses, but they no longer dictate action. You still experience preferences, but they no longer demand outcomes. The mind becomes less reactive, not because it is restrained, but because it is practiced. This only works when training leaves theory and enters daily life, discipline in ordinary moments. This practice is proven in ordinary moments. Discipline does not announce itself during dramatic events. It appears, or fails to appear, in what seems insignificant. Small delays, minor slights, routine inconvenience. This is where training either exists or it does not. Waiting for extreme situations to test discipline misunderstands how the mind works. The Stoic approach brings training into the day quietly, without tension. It does not add rituals for their own sake. It adds clarity to moments that already occur. The work is not to create special conditions, but to use what is already present. The first practice is anticipating impressions without anxiety. This is often misunderstood. Anticipation is not rehearsing worst outcomes or bracing for harm. It is simply recognizing that inconvenience, misunderstanding, and resistance will appear. You expect them accurately, without emotional charge. When the mind stops demanding smooth conditions, it is less startled when disruption arrives. For example, you expect delay when dealing with others. Not because people are incompetent or hostile, but because coordination is imperfect. When delay appears, it is familiar. The impression still arrives, but it carries less force. The mind has already accepted that this belongs to the day. Nothing new needs to be concluded. The second practice is pausing before assent. This pause does not require withdrawal or silence. It does not require you to freeze. It is internal and brief. Often one breath is enough. The breath is not a calming technique. It is a marker. It creates a fraction of space in which judgment can be examined. In that space, the question is simple: what am I about to agree with? Not how do I feel? And not what should happen next. But what judgment is forming right now? You may still choose to act. You may still speak firmly. But the action is chosen, not automatic. The pause restores authorship. This practice is most effective when applied to minor impulses. A slight irritation. The urge to correct someone unnecessarily. The impulse to check something repeatedly. These are low-cost opportunities. Each time you notice and pause, training is reinforced. The mind learns that agreement is optional. The third practice is evening review without guilt or praise. At the end of the day, you look back briefly. Not to judge character. Not to tally success. You simply observe where assent was given quickly, and where it was withheld. This is diagnostic, not evaluative. Guilt is not useful here. Guilt says, I should have been different, and adds another judgment to examine. Praise is also unnecessary. It risks turning discipline into performance. The review is factual. Here, I agreed too quickly. Here, I paused. Nothing more is required. This review reinforces responsibility without pressure. It trains recognition. Over time, patterns become visible. Certain situations consistently trigger quick assent. Certain thoughts repeat. Seeing this clearly is already progress. You are no longer surprised by your own reactions. These practices are deliberately modest. They do not promise transformation. They do not aim at constant calm. They aim at consistency. Discipline grows through repetition, not intensity. When practiced daily, even briefly, the pause becomes more accessible. The mind becomes less hurried. Importantly, this practice does not eliminate mistakes. You will still assent too quickly. You will still react at times. The difference is not perfection. The difference is recovery. You notice sooner. You return faster. You do not compound reaction with self-judgment. As this stabilizes, effort changes quality. You spend less energy resisting what has already happened. You spend more attention on what you are choosing now. The day feels less crowded internally, even if circumstances remain unchanged. When this practice becomes stable, a different kind of freedom appears, what remains untouchable. Freedom is often misunderstood. Many imagine freedom as the absence of obstacles, pressure, or discomfort. By this definition, freedom is fragile. It depends on cooperation from the world. It lasts only as long as conditions remain favorable. The Stoic understanding is narrower and more durable. Freedom is the preservation of authority over judgment. Life does not become easier through this practice. Inconvenience remains. Loss remains. Other people remain unpredictable. What changes is not the surface of events, but where command is located. Authority returns inward, where it cannot be revoked by circumstance. This is why Stoic freedom does not promise comfort. Comfort is external and temporary. It requires alignment between preference and outcome. Freedom does not. Freedom remains intact even when outcomes disappoint, because it does not depend on them. You may prefer things to go differently. Preference is allowed. What is withdrawn is the demand. What remains under your command is not the feeling that arises, but the meaning you assign to it. Pain may appear. Fear may appear. Fatigue may appear. None of these remove freedom unless they are granted authority. The mind is free to say, "This is unpleasant," without concluding, "This is unbearable," or "This must not be happening." That difference is decisive. This is also why freedom is maintained, not achieved. There is no final state where discipline is complete. Each day presents new impressions. Each impression asks for assent. Freedom exists only as long as judgment is exercised deliberately. When attention lapses, authority slips outward again. Nothing dramatic occurs. No principle is violated. Discipline simply pauses. The Stoics did not treat this as failure. They treated it as information. Freedom is not proven by never reacting. It is proven by how quickly authority is reclaimed. The return matters more than the lapse. This keeps the practice grounded and prevents rigidity. There is a quiet confidence that develops here. Not confidence in outcomes, but confidence in authorship. You trust that whatever appears, you will meet it at the point of judgment. You may still feel shaken. You may still feel disappointed. But you are no longer compelled to add conclusions that escalate disturbance. This form of freedom does not attract attention. It does not announce itself. From the outside, nothing remarkable may appear to change. Internally, the difference is structural. You stop negotiating with reality as if it owed you agreement. You stop interpreting discomfort as a violation. This alone removes a significant amount of unnecessary suffering. It is important to be precise here. This is not indifference. You still care. You still act. You still commit to work, relationships, and responsibilities. What changes is the belief that your well-being depends on their compliance. Care remains. Dependency does not. This distinction protects freedom over time. When you confuse freedom with comfort, discipline erodes the moment comfort is threatened. When you locate freedom in judgment, discipline becomes sustainable. You are not required to win, to be praised, or to avoid difficulty in order to remain sovereign. Nothing outside you must change for this to begin. No permission is required. No preparation beyond attention. The practice is always available, because the point of assent is always present. Even now, as you read this, impressions are forming. Judgments are being suggested. Agreement is optional. What cannot be taken from you is the ability to examine what you are about to agree with. As long as this capacity is exercised, freedom remains intact, regardless of circumstance. The principle is complete, keeping authority intact. Nothing here requires escalation. The mechanism is simple, even if practice is not. Impressions arrive. Judgment evaluates. Assent authorizes. Reaction follows. This sequence does not change with insight alone. It changes only when responsibility is accepted at the precise point where agreement occurs. Responsibility here is not heavy. It is exact. You are not responsible for what appears. You are responsible for what you endorse. This responsibility cannot be delegated to mood, habit, or circumstance. Each time you say, "I could not help it," you are describing speed, not necessity. The pause may be brief, but it exists. Keeping authority intact means returning to this pause again and again. Not with frustration. Not with self-correction. With recognition. You notice that agreement was granted too quickly. You do not defend it. You do not justify it. You simply see it. That seeing is already a return of authority. This practice does not demand perfection. It allows for imperfection without excuse. You will assent prematurely. You will react at times. The difference is that reaction no longer becomes a story about who you are or what must change externally. It becomes a signal to resume attention. The discipline described here does not promise relief. It offers ownership. You stop asking life to feel different so that you can be steady. You become steady by refusing to add judgments that escalate what is already difficult. This is a quieter strength and endurance. It does not resist what is present. It governs what follows. Over time, the mind becomes less eager to grant permission automatically. Not because it is restrained, but because it is practiced. Authority remains where it belongs. Not in outcomes. Not in approval. In judgment. This is not something you complete. It is something you maintain. Each moment presents the same choice. Agreement or suspension. Escalation or clarity. The work is small. It is repeated. And it is yours. Return to what is yours.